Namaste, everybody, once again, and it's a pleasure to come here and speak with the Center for Indic Studies. It's a long talk, but I'll try to shorten it as much as I can and try to do it as quickly as possible. So before I start, Om Shri Gurubhyo Namaha, pranams to all the teachers who have helped us on this journey and who continue to help us with their scholarship. So I'd like to straight away jump into a couple of hypotheses. Our talk today is going to be about the manufactured narrative of Aryan and Dravidian. Those are fighting words. So I'd like to present to you a couple of hypotheses, and we will try to see the evidence for either of these. So the first hypothesis is something that has been thoroughly neglected in India, which is the Purana model for peopling of India. How did India get populated? Who are the people in India? Those are the questions the Purana model attempts to answer. And for that, I'd like to start first with Ikshvaku, who's a southern king. And if you look at the Bhagavata Purana, it calls him out as a king of the Dravida Desha. Very surprising, isn't it? So from the Dravida Desha, he became Vaivasvata Manu, and the son of Surya, and he was the next Manu. And his sons were the progeny that we're going to study about. And this is the interesting thing from the internal evidence of the Puranas. If you look at the Puranic genealogy, it says that Manu, like I just showed you, was a southern king, and he appears very famously in the Matsya Purana. And he had a number of children. Just a few are shown in this flowchart over here. And on one side with Ikshvaku, he gives rise to the Solar dynasty, of which we know very well Rama, Ayodhya was part of the Solar dynasty. On the other side, through his daughter Ila marries Buddhan, which is Mercury, the son of Chandra, and she starts the Chandravamshi, the Surya, the lunar dynasty. And through that marriage came the Aila people. And through the Ailas, through Yayati and others, we have a whole lot of other dynasties that have populated India. And this is the Puranic genealogy for how India was populated. Now, if we take a closer look at who the Ailas were, what we find is that there is a geographical association with the various progeny of the Ailas. For example, you see that these people are in Mathura, and the Druhyus are the dynasties beyond the northwest frontier, which is outside of India. These are the Punjab dynasties. These is Kalinga, Vanga, Bengal, and Orissa, and those places. Hastinapura, which is in Haryana, and those places. Magadha. So you see very clearly that just through the Ailas dynasty, we see that the Puranas talk about how India was populated in a very early period of time. Now, the problem is that the Puranas are not easy to decode in terms of time. It's not easy to have an understanding of what time periods are they talking about, but we should take it with understanding that there is some history of genealogy encoded in these topics, where when they talk about being related to Manu and the Solar dynasty and Lunar dynasty, it's an attempt by that dynasty to see themselves as in that lineage. So very long time back, I guess, Parjita, who was one of the British Indologists, he called out their origin in Prayag, which is in Uttar Pradesh, and he identified the Ailas people with the northern people, and the Manvas people with the southern people, and the Saudyumnas people with the Munda people. And he said that this talks about the spread of different people in India through this particular Puranic genealogy. Okay, having said that, I'd like to present to you hypothesis number 2. Hypothesis 2 is the Indo-European language model for peopling of India. And what does this model say? This one I talked about is at length in my talks, the Kurgan Steppe hypothesis, which gives rise to Aryan invasion or migration theory, that says people called Yamnaya between Caspian Sea and Black Sea, how they, in 3 waves after domestication of the horse, they populated the world, where by 2500 BCE, they moved to the west, becoming the corded ware, to the east, becoming Andronovo people. By 1500 BC, they become the BMAC culture, and it enters into Sindh and India over here. And by 500 BCE, they become the Indo-Aryan, and you see the Dravidian people here. and they're basically spread throughout India. So the notion here is the Indo-European languages spread by migration. So that is the second hypothesis. Now, we have two hypotheses. How are we going to judge on which is the one that seems to support the evidence? What we'd like to see is what kind of model are we using? A good model should accommodate all the evidence coherently with little or no conflict. And like I say, there's a whole lot of data for history from archaeology, epigraphy, astronomy, sciences, religion, paleontology, genetics, literature, oral records. A whole lot of data is there. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So people have proposed various models like the linguistic model, the archaeology model, genetics model, astronomy model, and so many are there. So we say that a good model should explain the context multidimensionally and be used to predict or fill the gaps. And that's what we want to see over here. And whenever we talk about models, we should understand that they are an encoding of our knowledge of the real world, either through physical relationships or logical relationships, some attempt to connect what is the data we have found with what is the model, what is the hypothesis we have, what are we proposing. So if you adopt the Proto-Indo-European linguistic model for the Indo-European languages, the homeland being in Central Asia, it gives rise to the Aryan migration or invasion theory in 1500 BC from Central Asia. And we have to accept that the Sanskrit Hinduism is an import and Dravidians are a separate people. So what we find is that genetics today is using data and constraints from the linguistic model in order to make its claims. And there's a lot of evidence that does not fit the linguistic model, like astronomy, archaeology, oral records, and so on. I would like to propose an indigenous model. So this is the first time I'm proposing this, but all my talks have been leading towards this. The proposal is that the ancient and modern humans lived in India for an exceedingly long period of time. And the implication is Indian genetics is out of India with little inward biogenetics also in various time frames. Languages and religious thought co-evolved cooperatively in the region that we call India. And the implication is religious thought and language went out of India. There has been outward migration from India in various time frames and directions. And we imply that this has happened through the Northwest, as well as the East and the Southeast. There have been migrations out of India. We also say that knowledge systems, trade, and beliefs have co-evolved in India. And this co-evolution we're seeing between the North, South, East, and West. Remember, India is a very big country. There's no homogeneity that we're talking about. A lot of different kinds of people and other things. So the knowledge, trade, beliefs have co-evolved between different regions of India and have also gone out of India. Regional genetic mutations and language divergence, and the implication being this accounts for the genetic and separately evolved language diversity. So several Indic researchers have proposed some elements of this model. My contribution here is the coalescing of all these ideas into a coherent model. And like I noted, please see my talks for the past few years on various topics. They all lead towards this major goal. So I'd like to very quickly talk about which are the frameworks that have been applied in Indian history and who are the agencies that have done it. Today, we find there are 5 agencies that control the Indian history and identity, starting with the colonial framework, the Eurocentric framework, vested interest framework, liberal academic bias, and the Marxist. All of them have come with their own models, their own constraints, their own ideologies, and I call history plus ideology has meant a subversion of identity. That's what we see today. Indian history is a subverted ideology, history, because ideology has been used to subvert our identity. So the earliest frameworks we can think about is the colonial hegemony, which starting with the Portuguese, Dutch, French, and the British, which came hand in hand with Christian imperialism from 1500s to the present time. Examples being Robert Caldwell, Geo Pope, Ziegenberg, and De Nobili, and a whole lot of others. And it also led to this triangle of Eurocentrism, where the frameworks of linguistics, anthropology, and caste were applied by people like, for example, Herbert Risley, Max Muller, between 16th to the 20th century. So these are the early frameworks that were applied on the history of India, which led to the notion of Aryan invasion or the migration theory that we just talked about. And now there are newer frameworks. Today, the Aryan invasion migration theory has been fortified with an outsider lens, basically looking at sociology as a way to look at all the class dynamics and interactions in the Indian context, and the use of archaeology by Maria Gimbutas and Colin Renfrew, for example, and John Marshall after they discovered the Harappan civilization. And today, with the use of genetics by people like David Reich from 1990s to the present time, all of these things have got a strong impact on the Indian or the Hindu identity. And that's what I like to show over here. So there are divisive claims that are deriving from these frameworks. And the mainstream, which means a divisive claim, says that Aryan invasion or migration from Steppe, but evidence shows out of India. Proto-Dravidians are related to Iranian Elamite pastoral people, but there's no credible evidence for this, not supported by the internal evidence in the evidence-based narrative. They say Harappa people were Proto-Dravidians, but it's not supported by internal evidence. They say Dravidian support driven to the south. It is not supported by internal evidence. Genetics says Indians are Aryans, Dravidians, and tribal people, but we show that these are manufactured identities. And Vedic Aryans subjugated the Dravidians and caused poverty, but invasions are responsible for widespread poverty. I put question mark here because I've not shown evidence for this yet. This is the outcome of many talks I've given, plus things I'll show here in this talk. So here are some of the common Aryan invasion theory assertions. Here I put a camp as out of India, OIT, and Aryan invasion theory camp. So there is a dialogue is basically hitting against each other all the time. For example, on this side, it might say Harappa archaeology does not show any sign of invasion. And the Aryan invasion camp comes and says, perhaps it is not a migration, it is not an invasion, but it's a migration. This side, it says Harappa trade material has been found in Mesopotamia, Central Asia. It implies that trade is what spread the languages. This side, it says migration, horse, and chariot spread the Indo-European language. On this side, it says, all right, you're talking about horse. Rig Veda knows about horse. It has got 34 ribs in this particular verse. Central Asian horse has got 36 ribs. Aryan invasion says, wait a minute, Rig Vedic people did not know how to count and they mistook 34 for 36. Very, very strange assertion. And on this side, it says, Rig Veda is mentioning Saraswati River and many Mandalas before the so-called Aryan invasion theory. On this side, it says, no, Saraswati is a mythical river. So these are typically the way the battles have been going in the past and continue to happen even now. And on several other assertions have come in and people talk about many things. We'll talk about that. So the question is, are we Aryans and Dravidians? I'd like to talk very quickly about antiquity of human presence in India. I've already presented this work in my earlier talks. I'm just going to zoom through this. What I want to show for you here is that tools in Tamil Nadu are up to 1 million years old, found by the human species living there. Here's an example of a hand axe that has been found. Here is a science paper that it came out, 2011, Shanti Papu and others who talk about this. And I mentioned in my early talks that 1 million years ago, science tells us that it was not the Homo sapiens that we know about today. It probably was a Homo erectus that lived from approximately 2 million years ago to about 600,000 years ago. And this is the range of the Homo erectus all over India, Africa, and so on. They are known to have lived in social groups, used fire, had a tiny cranial capacity, 1100 cc maximum, used stone tools up to 70 kg tall, up to 6 feet tall, and so on. And just for the scale, I've shown you from the early human fossils that have been found, Homo sapiens occupies a small niche here for the last 200,000 years. Then I talked about a paper that came out in 2018, again, Kumar Akhilesh and Shanti Papu and others. And this paper talks about Tamil Nadu, Athirampakam, where they found 350,000-year-old tools, and these tools were all precision tools. The question I raised is, if scientists are telling us that Homo erectus died out 600,000 years ago, and modern man only came from Africa about 80,000 years ago, The question is, who was making these artifacts in India 350,000 years ago to 185,000 years ago? Who was making this? So it gives us a reason to suspect that the common narrative is perhaps incorrect. There's something more to it. I talked earlier about Narmada Man, which is a skull that was discovered in Narmada Valley in 1982, Arun Sonakia Geographical Survey of India. And this is measured by some researchers, and they measured the cranial capacity at up to 1,421 cubic centimeters. That's the size of the human skull, the modern human skull, meaning that it probably was a modern sample, not a Homo erectus, whose average is 1,000 cubic centimeters that we have seen in other places. And some of these researchers have assigned the sample as an early Homo sapiens sample. The genetics that early on in around 2000 and 1990, people studied the empty DNA studies, and they showed that a group of individuals from Africa perhaps crossed this Oman and other areas, and they came into India, triangular part of India, all the way to Sumatra and so on, between 85,000 to 75,000 years ago. So this is the understanding from empty DNA that there was some genetic content into India in this time frame. But note that I've already pointed out there was somebody else already living in India, and it does not appear to have been the Homo erectus. So it brings in the possibility that this is an additional DNA component that has come into India in this time frame. And if you look at archaeology of India from 40,000 years ago, you find Homo sapien artifacts all over the place, whether we are talking about early Stone Age, Middle Stone Age, Bronze Age, Iron Age. Anywhere in India you go, you find artifacts. All of these dots and other things are markers where archaeological finds have been found. And here is a paper that is in Antipalapuram in Andhra Pradesh, 35,000 years ago, rock shelter, some artifacts found from there. Then if you look at places like Bet-Dwarka, 35,000 years ago, Edekal caves in Kerala, 9,000 years ago, Ketavaram, Andhra Pradesh, 8,000 years ago, Birana, 10,000 years ago, Ramachandrapuram, 12,000 years ago, we find evidence of human artifacts in all of these places. In Birana, for example, up to 9,500 years before present, artifacts have been found, which is an exceedingly long period of time. If you look at recent news reports from Maharashtra, rock art has been found on some of these places. And from Deccan College, they have tentatively identified it about 10,000 years or even more older than that. Then I talked about a paper that came out in episodes in 2003 from National Institute of Ocean Technology in Chennai, where they sent a ship with sonar to the Gulf of Cambay over here, and they found a 9-kilometer long feature 40 meters below the sea level, which they suspect is the fortification of a city wall, which has been submerged 40 meters under the sea. They also dredged up a piece of wood, and this wood they carbon dated in Hyderabad as well as in Germany, and it came back with a date of 8,500 years to 9,300 years before present, showing that there are some coastal kingdoms that might have been sunken that belong to an exceedingly ancient period of time. Then you come to more recent Harappa times, which is about 5,500 years ago. We find some outstanding examples of pottery, jewelry, and all kinds of things over there. And closer to 2000 BCE, we have even found in Sanauli that the chariots over there from the Sindhu-Saraswati civilization, and the archaeologist says that these are all horse-driven chariots and not bullock-driven chariots. If you come further to the south to Kiradi, for example, we find examples of, for example, this terracotta pipes showing drainage and drainage along the walls and so on, all these things along the banks of the Vaigai River. And several finds have been got from Kiradi, very, very interesting finds over there. It shows, if you look at the artifacts over here, there are Tamil Brahmi pottery shards, and there are jewelry and a pestle with mortar and other such things, and jewelry. And there appears to be a hint of industry also in Kiradi. If you look at the beads and weaving industry, needle points, dyes, game pieces, and other things, it appears that Kiradi was also an industrial center. And if you go further south to Adichanallur in Tamil Nadu, we find urn burials and gold diadems and iron implements. and the bronze of the mother goddess, which I called it mother goddess with the inverted quotes because we only know about Devi and Shakti. We don't know anything called mother goddess. Skulls of foreigners and Mediterranean and Africa around 2500 BCE. They show that these are deep sea divers, because the skulls show abnormalities. And if you go even further to Mahabalipuram, you find that after the tsunami hit it, they revealed temples and brick temples and granite slabs and so on 2,200 years ago. And so I quickly gave you a roundup of Antiquity of India from archaeology to show material evidence for human presence in India from at least 1 million years ago. Artifacts have been found from all regions of India. And I'm asking the question, is it possible for such a vast population to be replaced genetically? If people say it's not replaced, then can the genetics even be overwhelmed if so many migrants came into India genetically showing their presence over here? I ask the question, why is there no evidence of invasion or large-scale movement in India, archaeologically or otherwise? And why is it that no Indic texts mention the inflow of outsiders? So quickly like to go to a roundup of the evidence from various areas. I've talked about Indian astronomy at length in my earlier talks, so I'm only going to give one summary slide over here. I'm asking the question, how can Vedic concept astronomical observations much before the so-called Aryan invasion? Aryan invasion, remember, 1500 BCE, and they said brought Sanskrit into India. However, our astronomy shows the nakshatra models mentioned in Atharva Veda and the Taittiriya Samhita, which can be dated to at least 3000 BCE. The Vedanga Jyotisha, which is one of our texts containing astronomy, has been dated to 1400 BCE. Shatapatha Brahmana, written by Rishi Yajnavalkya, says Kritika never swerves from the east, and this can be dated to 2982 BCE. The calendar system reference, which some people call as Kali Yuga, planets clustered in Revati Nakshatra, can be dated to 3102 BCE. We have in the Rig Vedic story of Aditi and the vernal equinox mentioned at Punarvasha Nakshatra, which has been dated by Lokmanya Tilak as well as Professor Abhayankar to 6000 BCE. Ashwini, Surya, Sanjana story and the heliacal rising of Ashwini in the winter equinox, solstice, has been dated to 7200 BCE. There is a proper motion of Swati that has been measured. Swati is one of the nakshatras, and that star is moving in the sky. And the position of the star mentioned in Surya Siddhanta compared with today's value, we can see that that observation was done in 8000 BCE, more than 10,000 years ago. A phenomenon called Rohini Shakata Veda can be dated to 9000 BCE, and the Agastya story is at least 10,000 BCE, if not even more older than that. So this is just a sampling of some of the archaeoastronomical artifacts I've talked about at length in the past. And the question comes, if the Aryans came with Sanskrit only in 1500 BCE, how is it that the internal evidence of the text show much, much greater antiquity? So that is an evidence to keep in mind. And I'm talking about how astronomy invalidates Max Muller periods. Max Muller suggested Chandas period, Mantra period, Brahmana period, Sutra period. In these times, the books of Rig Veda, remaining books, Sama, Yajurveda, Samhita, Aranyakas, Upanishads, Vedangas, these are all written in these time frames. But I've shown that Vedanga Jyotisha is 1400 BCE. Where is 1400 BC? Where is Vedangas at 200 Sutra period according to Max Muller? Clearly some problems here. Similarly, in Shatapatha Brahmana, we have Kritika Nakshatra at 2982 BCE. But Max Muller said Brahmana period is 800 to 600 BC. Clearly, it is off by a large margin. Rig Vedic concepts of Aditi and Ashwinis up to 7200 BCE, but Max Muller thinks that it was in 1200 BCE. So clearly, the dates that Max Muller brought out of a hat, literally, have been completely invalidated by the internal evidence of the text that we have using astronomy. So from that, I'd like to very quickly jump into genetics itself, which is a framework that has been used today by a lot of people. Early on, people used the mtDNA, maternal mitochondrial DNA, to talk about migration of people. Then they used the male Y chromosomal markers to talk about migration. And today people use genome-wide, meaning all the chromosomes that are on the human body, can we use them at length to talk about migrations. There are three kinds of studies. Differences in genome tell the story of migrations. However, the story becomes a little hazy when they start talking about this is the source of a marker and that is the sink of a marker. The story becomes even more murky when they start talking about when did the common ancestor between two different populations live. So I put my confidence level with genetics marker with a downward arrow showing downward confidence. The presence and absence of a marker, differences in genome, no problem with that. If I say I carry a marker and our host Samir Pandey is not carrying that marker, there's no doubt about it. However, if I say that the percentage of markers in this population is 30% or 40%, and this genetics came from that place to this place, that means that is a source and this is the sink, I have some problems with that analysis. Then they also say that this population over here inherited about 30% of genetic flow from that ancient sample that we see in Central Asia or somewhere, implying a direction as well as a percentage of inheritance. I have major problems with this analysis. So concerns with methodology, and due to which results cannot be global. One has got to scrutinize models, methodology, data, samples, and claims. If you look at the earliest maternal M and N haplogroups of interest to India, what we find from the maternal mitochondrial work is that once they came from out of Africa into India, it is from India that all the other samples went out, whether it went to Australia, Southeast Asia, or whether it went to China, Siberia, and North America, or to Europe. We see that once it is out of Africa, it is from India that these genomes went out. This is what the maternal mitochondrial DNA is telling us. And I put over here, you can't see this, so I'll just skip this. We also have results with the Y-chromosomal haplogroups, and there are about 14 major Y haplogroups. However, 90% of Indians belong to 7 haplogroups, and 77% of us belong to 4 major haplogroups, R, H, L, and J. And I put for you a table over here showing what is the percentage in the Indian population of these haplogroups, how old are they, these mutations, and where did they come from, these mutations? And I give the example of a paper over here that shows R, for example, 38% of Indians have this. It's at least 27,000 years old, this mutation. Origin is in India. Similarly, the H, 30,000 years ago in India. L, also in India. J perhaps came from West Asia. Origin about 15,000 years ago. If you look at this table over here, where did these various haplogroups come? The H, the J, the L, R1A, and R2. Here are different researchers from 2003 to 2010, and I've highlighted whenever they said India, North India, South Asia is a place where it came from. And as you can see, the H is definitely in India. R1A, many people here are saying India is the place where it originated. And so we see that both the mtDNA and the Y chromosomal work are indicating an Indic origin, and it fails to validate the linguistic model. Then there are people who said that we need to have a higher resolution of the R1A. If you take a higher resolution, which is the R1A Z93, the claim was we can find that Central Asia is a place between Black Sea and Caspian Sea where this genome arose and came to India with the Aryan invasion theory. And that is where we see David Rice's work. So he says Central Asians and Indians have a common ancestor 4,000 years ago, approximately 2000 BCE, through the R1A Z93 model. However, if you look at Professor Lookout, another work, that one says Indians and Central Asians have a common ancestor through Z93 15,000 years ago. So I'm calling out this bizarre divergence in results, 4,000 to 15,000 years, and saying these huge differences are because of the methods they use, the models, sampling, and data, and it does not inspire confidence in ancestry estimation using the methods of genetics, because I've talked about this in the past. I'll not bore you about this. The mathematical methods, whole lot of different assumptions and appropriateness, scaling, convergence, initialization, other things go into making of these mathematical models for genetics. And just because convergence was obtained, it does not confer correctness on the models. So we don't have the time to talk at length about this. However, I'll present two papers. This is a 2018 claim on genome-wide research that came from David Rice's group from Harvard Medical School. This model in 2018 said Iranian pastoralists came to India around 7000 BCE and became the southern Indians, and they were also present in northern India. And then after 3000 BC, this Yamnaya people came into India between 2000 to 1500 BC. This is the Aryan invasion theory, and they mixed with the North Indians. So I criticized this talk at that in this paper in a talk of mine where I said, you're not showing anything about the Anu and the Drihyu, which the internal evidence of India says that they migrated out of India, whether you look in Bhagavad Purana, Vayu Purana, Vishnu, Brahmanda, Matsya, Rig Veda, they're all talking about the Drihyu who migrated out of India. Where does that show up over here? It does not show in this research. There was a drying up of Saraswati and a 200-year monsoon failure in India that resulted in outward migration. Where does that show in this graph? It does not. So he said there are several problems over here in this research. And soon enough, in 2019, in Science, Narasimhan and David Reich and others came up with a paper where they added 11 additional samples which they recovered in a place in Iran who were supposedly in cultural contact with the Indus Valley people. And the minute they introduced these into the mathematical model, it no longer converged to that old answer, which is shown here, which I've crossed it out. It converged to a new answer. That new answer said there is no migration from the Iranian pastoralists to India in 7000 BCE. However, they still claim that the Aryans came to India around 2000 BCE to 1500 BCE and constituted this. So that claim is still over there. Then if you look at the work by Vasant Shinde and Narasimhan and others, they are talking about the indigenous Harappa, Aryans from Central Asia. And they say that between there's a separate Indus Valley cline, and this has got a common ancestor with the Iranian hunter-gatherers more than 10,000 BC, 12,000 years ago. And the lineage split over here, and here's where you start seeing the Iranian hunter-gatherers slowly mixing with the Anatolian farmers, and you see this kind of a framework. So they claim that Indians are mostly this Indus Valley cline, indigenous to India, until the so-called mixing from Central Asia, which they're still holding on to. So my rebuttal has been that there are several problems with genetic studies, and one cannot globalize the results that they're making. One can only take narrow claims from the genetic studies. We cannot conclude a genetic influence to India with Indo-European language expansion. And I'm saying it does not show the effect of internal evidence and so many other problems. Here's a paper that is there in 2018 Current Science that talks about wild rice and cultivated rice in India in 9,000 years ago. So this is from the Paleo Sciences Institute, Birbal Saini Institute of Paleo Sciences. And basically this invalidates a claim that agriculture was invented in Turkey in 7000 BCE and spread to India. It looks like there was already paddy cultivation in India in that time in the Ganga plains. I've talked about this also in the past, the mouse migration 12,000 years ago. This is a paper that is highlighted by Premendra Priyadarshi. In this genome biology paper in 2007, this researcher says the common house mice has got an ancestor in India. It's approximately 12,000 years ago. And from India, it migrated to Africa, Madagascar, and Europe, China, Southeast Asia, and everywhere. India is a place it went out, and approximately in 12,000 years. And we know the agriculture and storage. So if you take this rice cultivation paper 9,000 years ago, and you take this mouse migration paper, they're telling a very, very strong story that cultivation of rice and export of agriculture or agricultural ideas led to mouse migration also out of India. Very, very interesting paper over here. We also have a paper in Sciences that came in July 2019 about how this familiar Indian cattle called zebu, the humped bull, this is found in the Mitanni lands. Mitanni is northern Iraq and Turkey in Hittite lands. It is found over there. And this talks about how when there was a drought in Indus Valley 4,200 years ago, people prefer to have this drought-adapted zebu bulls from India, and we suddenly see their population going up, talking about migration from India into the Fertile Crescent about 2200 BCE. Now, just to touch upon the model of linguistics. So I just given to you two researchers. I've not gone into their works. You can go and look further into their papers and their books and so on. This is Srikant Thalagiri. He says the Proto-Indo-European homeland is not in Central Asia, but it is in Northwest India. If you put the place as Northwest India, he said all of the evidence that we have suddenly falls in place. If you have it as Central Asia, he found several objections to that, why there are problems with that approach. Then on the other side, Nicolas Cazanas, who says that in my view, the mainstream academic publications on the subject of reconstructing PIE are worthless. And the strong reaction is because he felt these migrations are so much more ancient than what the people are saying that we don't even have the data to reconstruct these languages. Very, very interesting set of arguments over there. Then the Saraswati River itself. Remember that there are a lot of people who go around in India saying this is a mythical river. However, this is a paper that came out in November 2019 from Anirban Chatterjee and others. And they did analysis on the luminescence analysis on the sands in these paleo channels. And they found sand layers 3 to 10 meters below the surface on both sides of the Ghaggar in a stretch of 300 kilometers up to the Pakistan border. And the presence of the sand is an indication of existence of a powerful river in the past. So they have also talked about the phases of the river and so on. Very, very interesting paper that talks about the existence of the Saraswati River. So what I've done so far is I presented to you two hypotheses. The first hypothesis, as I said, is a Purana model that talks about the peopling of India based upon the genealogies presented. The second hypothesis was Indo-European language expansion from Central Asia. That is what led to the Aryan invasion theory and so on and so forth. And I went on from there to show you archaeology in India, how artifacts are present from 1 million years ago till very recent times. We find human presence in India. And from there, I went to the genetics and talked about genetics. Then I talked about astronomy, I talked about linguistics, I talked about several other things like Saraswati and so on. Now, with all of these things, we can say that we can comprehensively address the issue of Aryan invasion theory and say that there are major question marks in that linguistic model, and maybe an out-of-India model better describes the data. So from that, I want to go to the corollary. The corollary of Aryan invasion theory is Dravidianism, because they say that the Dravidians are the Harappa people who are driven to the south, right? So we're going to look at what is the evidence we have for that. So Dravidians' claims are unique to Tamil Nadu. It is a non-issue in Karnataka, AP, Telangana, Kerala. Claims there's an ancient Dravidian civilization, the sunken continent called Kumari Kandam. Says Harappa people were Dravidians. Aryan invasion drove them to the south. Aryans suppressed the Dravidians. Says Tamil is the oldest language, distinct from Sanskrit. Dravidian people are racially distinct from North Indians. Oldest Indian script is in Tamil Brahmi. Sen Tamil or pure Tamil can be got by removing Sanskrit from the works. Dravidian people are descended or related to the Elamites, and Thiruvalluvar, who was a famous saint in Tamil Nadu, was influenced by Thomas the Apostle, according to the Dravidian Christian movement of recent times. These are some of the claims. So I'd like to show that the manufacture of Kumari Kandam. Kumari Kandam is a word that first appears in Kanda Puranam, written in this time frame by Shivacharya, as a place where Shiva worshipping Brahmins live, and is not connected with land loss. However, 20th century Tamil supremacists, they seized upon the failed theory of Lemuria to propose there was a lost land here. They said that there was a land all the way from southern India to Madagascar on this side, up to Australia on this side. And this is the Kumari Kandam, which they claimed. And the question is, can we validate this using science? Well, I'm not going into the Ice Age and other things which I talked in my earlier talks. Here, I'd just like to show you the sea depth level. Excuse me. If you use Google Earth and you see the depth of the waters here, you find that the depth of the water here is 4,570 meters, 4.5 kilometers. Here it is 5.1 kilometers, 5.2 near Australia, 3.8 here, 3.7 near this place. And I am saying that even if we are talking about the time of the late glacial maximum ice age, when most of the water is locked up in ice, sea level would have been lower than what it is today. We know the sea level was lower by 122 meters. So if there's any place over here that is 122 meters, we can say, yes, that was Kumari Kandam. And after the ice ages melted, the water level sunk that continent. However, we don't see that. We only see deep ocean wherever we look over here. If you come closer to India, we find that across the continental shelf, we find 120 meters, 150 meters, here's 1000 meters, 91 meters, 10 meters, here it is land bridge, 0 meters, 8 meters here, 3.5 kilometers here, 3.9 kilometers, over here 2.1, 1.2 kilometers. So we know that during the last ice age, India's extent would have been approximately 90 kilometers beyond Kanyakumari. Maybe this length over here, according to this scale. So maybe it's a little more, maybe about 120 kilometers or so outside Kanyakumari. I estimated approximately 160,000 square kilometers would have been lost during the ice age melting approximately 7,000 years ago, 5,000 years ago. The melting would have led to these areas going underwater, but definitely not this huge landmass. So this basically invalidates the notion that there is a Kumari Kandam. So the first Dravidian claim, we can knock it out saying, no, there wasn't a civilization. If there was one, it probably was in this area. Then the next notion about scripts. What is a Harappa script and how is it related to later Brahmi scripts? We want to find out that. There are three hypotheses on the Indus script. I talked about this in my earlier talks. Rajesh Rao's talk, he says that hypothesis number one, Indus Valley script does not encode a language. It's more like a signboard, like you see the signboards like this. That's what it is. Another hypothesis is that the script is encoding an Indo-European language, like, for example, Sanskrit. A third hypothesis is it is encoding a Dravidian language. So he conducted an experiment, mathematical experiment, to find out the entropy content in various things. For example, these are DNA sequence, protein, and music sequences. So the entropy or disorder is very, very high in these languages. However, when he computed the entropy for languages like Fortran, which is a programming language, very structured programming language, or Indus script, Tamil, Sanskrit, and other languages, they're all clustered over here. So what you see, linguistic languages are all clustered. Non-linguistics are all clustered over here. Fortran is separated out here because it is very, very limited in what it can disorder that it has. So by this, Rajesh Rao came and said that Indus is probably, the script is probably encoding a linguistic method. And Dr. Srini Kalyan Raman, he says that it is a rebus. The idea is rebus, which is that's a picture puzzle. Each of these logograms is showing something in cryptic form, and he draws from the classical languages of India and the tribal languages to show what those things might have meant. And here's another book by Egbert Richter Ushanas, who is saying that the logograms are communicating Rigvedic concepts, in other words, Sanskrit. S.R. Rao also, he showed that 62 signs are encoding Sanskrit in this particular work. Asko Parapula, a Finnish researcher, he tried to show that if you assume that it's encoding Dravidian languages, he tried to see that what these things might mean, and he gave an interpretation if the assumption was a Dravidian. Similarly, Iravatan Mahadevan, he also assumed Dravidian, and he said that if you think it's Dravidian, these are all the meanings from these words. And I'm saying that when a phenomena is described by multiple models, it means that a key discriminator is still missing because there are several things that are fitting this model, different hypotheses. We still need something to discriminate it and saying that this is what it is, and we don't have such a discriminator yet. So here's an interesting work that Professor Subhash Kak did, 1990. He took the most common Indus signs and the most common Brahmi letters and tried to see what is the percentage by which they appear in certain works. And he said, this is the most common Brahmi word, second most common frequency-wise, and so on. And he compared it with the Indus signs. And you see that there is a one-on-one, there is a correspondence. This is just an upside down of this. This is again very related to this, related to this. We start seeing that, yes, it appears that there is some kind of a relation between Indus sign and what became Brahmi later. And here is one more paper by Subhajit Ganguly, 2012, that shows how the Indus signs might have evolved into the Brahmi script. Here is what the colonial historians have proposed, saying that if you think that this is the Brahmi script, this is how Brahmi script evolved and gave the Nagari script that we see today. On this side, how it is related to Archaic Greek or Roman or English, these are the evolutions. Of course, they propose that Phoenician was the oldest. Phoenician gave rise to Brahmi script as well as these European scripts. However, we know the earliest Phoenician alphabet is 850 BCE in the Ahiram sarcophagus, whereas the transitive Brahmi can be dated about 1500 BCE. Seems that the Brahmi is older than this particular script. We see that a lot of the modern scripts that we have in India, whether it's Tamil, Malayalam, Sinhala, Burmese, or Gurmukhi, Oriya, all of these are related to the Brahmi script, through Gupta to Nagari to these things, through Grantha to Tamil to Malayalam and others, and to Kannada and such things. So we also know that script went out of India, influenced China as well as Japan and Southeast Asia and so on. These are all a little biased because they do not show migration to the west. Observed only shows it is impacting to the east and not to the west. In Bet-Dwarka, which is an island off from Gujarat, there was an investigation done, and this particular paper reports all the archaeological finds there. And S.R. Rao, he looked at some pottery shards and he decoded that and said that this is a transitive Brahmi script, and he decoded this as old Indo-Aryan Iranian language to about 1500 BCE. Very, very interesting. If you look at Tamil Brahmi, some of the oldest Brahmi that we found in the country is in Tamil Nadu in various pottery shards. And here are some examples of that. Here's some example from Purana in around 500 BCE. And Brahmi, we know how it gave rise to modern Tamil, as well as what is going on that side. The chronology for Tamil is the oldest Tamil is in Tamil Brahmi, the script-wise, which gave rise to Pallava Grantha, Chola Pallava, Vijayanagara, and the modern Tamil. On this side, there was a dead end. It gave to Vattarthu, and nothing happened to this after some time. This is the modern evolution on this side. We also have non-Harappa references to writing. So if you look at Max Muller, he says writing started in the Sutra period. Panini. Panini refers to Lipi Kara, who's a scribe, as well as to Yavanai Lipi. Manu is referring to writers as well as to forgers of land. Rishi Yajnavalkya is referring to writing on cotton cloth or cotton plates. Remember, we placed Yajnavalkya to 2982 BC in Shatapatha Brahmana, based on the Kritika Nakshatra. So he's referring to writing in that period of time on cotton cloth or copper plates, and many others are referring to writing too. So writing is something that's there throughout in India, and everybody knows this very familiar scene. Vyasa's dictating the Vedas, and Ganesha has broken off his tusk and is writing on that. So conclusion from Southern archaeology and script, the Vaigai River excavation, carbon dating is 600 BCE and so on. We talked about Indus script, 3 hypotheses, whether it encodes signs or Aryan or Dravidian. We talked about the transitive script in Bet-Dwarka, which is 1500 BCE. We talked about Brahmi derived from Harappa script through this transitive mechanism. Tamil Brahmi, the oldest finds is in Purana, but now Kiradi is giving us some newer artifacts. Brahmi gave rise to all the Indian language scripts, and we cannot say whether Tamil Brahmi is the oldest. That's the conclusion from what I just shown. Now, script is one thing, and language is an entirely different beast. So if you look at the material evidence for Tamil, Shulman, who's a Hebrew University professor, he says the word Tamil, Tam means our own. He says it originates from our own sounds, translation to Tamil. He also says that the Sanskrit word Dravida refers to Tamil through this derivation, Tamil giving us Tamil, giving us Tamila, and supposedly to Dravida. However, I put an exclamation mark here showing incredulousness of this particular transition. if you look at the inscription, the material evidence, Hathigumpa inscription, Bhubaneswar, is referring to a Tamira Samgata, the confederacy of Tamil rulers in 150 BCE and Tamil kingdoms. Also in Amravati inscription and Nagarjuna Konda and other places, we have Jataka tales, we have got Tamil mentioned over here. The word Dravidian, Dravida is a Sanskrit word. It is not referring to a race, it is referring to a geographical region of southern India. Varahamihira, for example, in Brihat Samhita, he places Dravida to the southwest and east. Parashara is placing it to the east, referring to a specific people. Dravida is used in Tantra Vatika by Kumarila Bhatta. Adi Shankara and Saundarya Lahiri, he's saying that he's a Dravida Shishu. And the missionary Robert Caldwell, he's the person who used the word Dravidian. And we see the history of the Sanskrit-Dravidian split. My question was, who was the first person who thought the separate language family in India? So till 1700s, William Carey, Wilkins, Colebrook, they all believed that all languages in India derived from Sanskrit. However, A.C. Campbell, he wanted to prove them wrong. So he wrote a book called Telugu Grammar in 1816. And his teacher, Francis White Ellis, he wrote the foreword, a 40-page foreword, which has come to be called the Dravidian proof. So he used a word list. Shastri gave him the word list from Panini's word list, Dattapara. So he compared the Sanskrit words to Telugu words, and he said that it is clear there is a different language that we're talking about. For example, he used a word for milk, whether it's doodh in Hindi, or it is palu in Telugu, or halu in Kannada, or pal in Tamil. He tried to show no relation at all. So things like that. Compared the word list and the cognates and other things, and he proposed as a different language. And the minute he said that there's a different language family, it was eagerly embraced by two missionaries, G.U. Pope as well as Robert Caldwell. And today's scholarship has taken that as received wisdom, and they say that there is a Proto-South Dravidian, where Kannada, Tamil, Malayalam are related, North Dravidian, where Kuruk, Malto, Brahui are related, South Central, where Telugu and Gondi and others are related, and Central Dravidian, where these languages are related over here. So if you look at Pope's G.U. Pope, this missionary, his interest was to show that the Tamil people, Thiruvalluvar, was influenced by Saint Thomas, who lived at the same time, and he wanted to show influence of Christianity on Tamil works. So that was his interest. Caldwell was another missionary whose primary concern was to convert the South Indian to Christianity, according to his biographer. So he introduced these ideas that the Southern Indian is ethnically distinct from the Northern Indian. He introduced a pejorative called Brahminical Aryan. So if you see the word Brahminical Aryan in your NCERT books, you should know the Marxists are using the word that he introduced in a very negative way. He introduced the idea that the South Indian is oppressed and subdued by the Aryans. And he also said you could get pure Dravidian languages by removing the Vedic Sanskrit out of it. So clearly, he had wanted to divorce the Southern Indian from the Vedic religion. One way to do that is to cut them off from Sanskrit first, and then from the Vedic religion, and then they can convert them into Christianity. And today, the Tamil Nadu government has honored him, and you see statue in Marina Beach. And his legacy has been embraced by a lot of Dravidianists, including this EVR, the Dravidar Kazhagam movement, and a whole lot of political parties today, DMK and AIADMK, all of them have taken on this very bigoted way of looking at the Indian civilization and thinking of themselves as separate people. And there's a dark legacy of Robert Caldwell, intellectually also. Today you find people like Narsimachari, who says ancient Dravidian religion is agamic and Vedic religion is sacrificial based. Worship of Ishtadevata is a Dravidian religion into this world. So a whole lot of strange ideas. However, I put this over here to show if you take any sampling of Indian authors, whether you're talking about Abhinavagupta, Adi Shankara, Agatyar, or Yajnavalkya, Vyasa, anybody in any time frame you go, including Thiruvalluvar, Sangam saints, and others, Not one person is talking about Aryan invasion theory. Not one person is saying we are northerners, those people are southerners, we are separate people, they are separate people. Nobody's talking these things. So we find that amazing thing that for the longest time, Indians thought of themselves as the same people, same culture, same religion, same everything, heritage. However, the missionaries came 200 years ago and injected a noxious idea into people's heads, Southern Indians' heads, and Tamil people now believe that they are Dravidian race and so on. Very, very amazing how they can wipe out centuries of cultural contact and knowledge and information and take over some strange ideas. This is Dr. Nagaswamy, who wrote this, a retired ASI general of Tamil Nadu Circle, wrote this book, Tamil Nadu, Land of Vedas. And after years of work in Tamil Nadu, looking at epigraphy and Sangamira works, medieval works, and so on, he concludes that Vedic practice is deeply ingrained in the earliest Tamil works. You can't be divorced from that. You may not be able to read these names, but these are the names of some of the Sangam poets, Gautamam, Valmiki, Kaushikan, Damodaran, and so on. As you can see, Bharadwajan, all these are Vedic names. And what are they doing in Sangamira poets? If the claim is that Dravidians don't know about Vedic religion was imposed on them by Aryan invasion, what are these things happening over here? Similarly, if you look at the work of David Shulman, who's a professor in Hebrew University, he also examined a lot of literary works in his book over here. And he says that the erasure of Tamil intellectual tradition is happening, this intellectual tyranny born of linguistic nationalism basically is referring to this practice of removing the idiom of Vedas or of Sanskrit out of Tamil and trying to reconstruct a so-called ancient past that did not have those things. So it's an erasure that is happening right now. That's what he's lamenting over here. And he's saying that Shaiva Siddhanta has been distorted as non-Brahmin and Dravidian religion. And he's saying the British missionaries, educators, they have promoted Dravidian as non-Brahmin and non-Sanskrit past. He concludes there never was a time that Tamil existed independently of Sanskrit. Very, very powerful words from two different people. Then I did some research myself into the artifacts found in Adi-Channallur and Perambalur. And between 2500 BC to 500 BCE, it turns out that even the burial sites that have been seen, for example, outside Tirunelveli, the burial sites are seen on the southern end of the ancient settlements. In Vedic times, town planning always put the graves of the cremation areas to the south, because south is Yama's domain. You find the same cultural practice in Adi-Channallur. Gold diadems have been found. These are pattams that the people used to wear. Even today, if you look at weddings, in many cultures in India today, you find the male wears a gold pattam on the head at the wedding time. A stone Ganesha was also found by the colonials. They also found a Trishulam. A Trishul has been found in the same place. And in one of the cysts, a human skeleton was found, a cross-legged posture, as if in yoga, with the hands resting on the knees. And like I said, also a stone Ganesha has been found. So these things are showing that an exceedingly ancient period of time, it appears there already was Vedic kind of practices here. So where is the question of Aryan invasion bringing these things here? I'll skip this slide. I think I'll skip that. I'll talk about this for just a minute. There is now a theory that India is a Sprackbund, meaning a linguistic area, a place where different languages come in contact with each other as an alternative to a model of migrations or invasions and things like that. It's an area where different languages exist and mix, and that falls in line with the idea that I've been talking about, that they co-evolved in India. Skin tone. This is one big hang-up in many Southerners, especially from Tamil Nadu. If you take a look at, people say that, look, this man is so fair and I'm so dark. That means he and I are different races. He's not the same race as me, which is a spurious construct. If you see this paper, it talks about light skin allele of SLC24A5 is both in South Asians as well as in Europeans. This is something that is present in the 15th genome of the human chromosome. The 15th chromosome of the human genome. It is common to European and South Asians. It was inherited probably from a common ancestor for the Europeans and Asians about 30,000 years ago, somewhere near India. It is mostly northern Indians, but also in southern Indians. It controls the expression of melanin, and melanin decides what is your skin color tone you'll take as a result of exposure to sunlight at different latitudes, whether you're in a latitude closer to the equator, direct sunrise, more energy of the sun, or northern latitude where lesser. So this is what is responsible for skin tone and not race at all. So conclusion from this, we talked about some assertions of Dravidianism. It's highly unlikely there's a Kumari Kingdom. Brahmi appears derived from Harappa. There are south and north variants in the south. It impacted the Indic family. We don't have sufficient evidence that Harappa is Dravidian. The division of Indic languages into Aryan and Dravidian based on Ellis ideas have to be re-examined. Nagaswamy and Shulman, they identify Vedic and oldest Tamil literature, color differences due to an allele, and Dravidianism therefore is a spurious, manufactured identity. So I'm come to nearly to the end of my talk here. So finally, the case for pan-India unity. If you look at the works by B.B. Lal, who was an archaeologist in India, at the tail end of his career, he came and wrote a paper that talks about continuity of civilization. That shows how, if you look at the Pashupati seal in Harappa, or the swastika symbol over there, or the terracotta figurines with the Sindur symbol on the females, the Namaste pose, the Shivalinga and Kalibangan, or the yoga asanas in the terracotta figurines. He said all these things show there is a continuity of cultural thought. There is no such thing as a separate Harappa period followed by a separate Vedic period. Instead, he's saying these ideas are there in all strata. It appears to be a cultural continuity. If you look at throughout India, the calendars that people are using, people use celestial calendars based on the number of muhurtas, the new moon, full moon, nakshatra model, the solstice equinox, the solar model, the 6-year synchrony of the lunar solar with Adhika Masa, the 12-year cycle of Jupiter, 30-year cycle of Saturn, Samvatsara cycle, the 19-year moon cycle, the Yuga models, transits and conjunctions and occultations. All these things have been known throughout India, north, south, east, west. This seems to be a common practice. If you look at the calendars that are used in different parts of India, for example, the Purnimanta month, the Amanta month, and the southern Amanta and the solar calendar. So in different parts of India, the only difference is based on whether you're using the Amanta or the Purni Amanta, whether your month starts from new moon to new moon or from full moon to full moon. Only that changes from different parts of India. If you look at other things like dance forms, common throughout India, the cultural idiom is similar. They all came out of Bhagavata Purana. If you look at the music, people say there are differences, Hindustani and Carnatic and so on. They all have their roots in Samaveda, and we can show that. The food, they have got topical differences based upon the items you find in the north and south, but they're very similar. If you look at the bride, for example, very, very similar, both sides. If you look at the Sandhi and the grammar used in works, they're also similar. So whether it's worship, epics, sciences, math, medicine, grammar, or the idiom, what we find is throughout India, we've got cultural similarity. And this is the very end of my talk here. The story of India is vast, complex, and multidimensional. Aryan and Dravidian are spurious identifiers. I hope I've given you a lot of evidence, though I know I walked very, very quickly because we have time limitations here on that. I presented evidence against a linguistic model. I presented a pan-India script deriving from Harappa and Brahmi. I questioned the received wisdom of Dravidian proof on the language separation, presented pan-India astronomy and showed antiquity. I questioned the utility of genetics in addressing identity. I presented various dimensions of cultural similarity. And the bottom line is India is united by its ancient culture and heritage, and its identity is that of the Dharmic civilization. Today, we are seeing there is a destruction of that Indian identity by the 5 malicious forces that I talked about. So with that, I come to the end of my talk. So thank you very much for listening to my talk. So I'll stop sharing, and I think can open it up now for questions if the host can coordinate that.
Thank you, Rajji. That was a very fine presentation. And now the question session is now open. So please raise your Zoom hand to ask one question, and please make it short. And the option is below on the screen. It's in the participants you can click on the participants, and then there will be an option for that. So, Ravi Chila Kamari, you can ask the question.
Thank you so much, Raji. Wonderful work. I'm pretty sure so much of research has gone into this. My quick question is, when we are presenting evidence, or when you are presenting evidence through information from Puranas or other scriptures, was there a sense of that those things will be brushed away, calling as mythology or something like that?
Well, yes, if you have seen my earlier talks, I also show what kind of thinking led to that. So in the 5 frameworks that I talked about, one of them was the colonial and the Christian ideologies. So they came with the framework that God created the world in 4004 BCE, and God destroyed the world in Noah's flood, 3000 BCE, and nothing could have survived that flood event. You can't have memory of what happened before that, and so on. In the Indian context, they found these astronomical artifacts as well as these Purana accounts that seem to be talking before the flood event. And so they couldn't take that. So they said that if there are accounts before the flood event, the possibility is the Indian chronology is wrong, because these guys fervently believed in this Anglican church idea of 4004 BCE. So they went about a process of so-called correcting the Puranic chronology. And in the process of doing that, they also turned around and said it's an unreliable genealogy. So they did not take anything from that. Rather, they started taking whatever they could out of it, and the rest of it, they said it's unreliable. And one example of that is Max Muller. I showed to you Max Muller dating, and I showed how the Indic content is showing astronomy that has rather internal evidence of astronomy that is much older than the periodization proposed by Max Muller. Max Muller himself was criticized by his fellow Europeans. In a conference, somebody came and asked, Mr. Max Muller, should all of Indian chronology be hostage to the biblical chronology? This man got so upset with that question, he wrote an entire book on Indian astronomy, where he tried to address why he was doing things the way he was doing it. He only accepted Colebrook. Colebrook is a fellow European. He accepted Colebrook's dating of Vedanga Jyotisha to 1400 BCE because that is after the so-called Aryan invasion. So he also laid that popular thinking that Puranas are unreliable as sources of knowledge or information or history, and that has become fashionable to the current time where people discard the Indian texts as unreliable. So we have this bizarre spectacle ahead of us where we have got centuries, literally tens of thousands of years of work, oral records captured in writing and so on, which we are deeming as unreliable. We're not using it. We'd rather go with what these guys discovered about 200 years ago with their own chronology, their own reworking of Indian chronology, king list, and so on to fit their frameworks. So this is the bizarre spectacle that we are seeing today in academia, Indian intelligentsia, whether it is in the West, in the East, everywhere it is the same. So the challenging has got to be done. People have to look at the Indic sources and ask these relevant questions. I showed a slide with hundreds of, dozens of Indian author names. And they said, why are their works not relevant? Why is it that we don't study about the rishis? Why is it that my children don't learn about Yajnavalkya? Was he a mythical figure? Who wrote Shatapatha Brahmana? That book exists, its formulas exist, its prescriptions exist, but we are told that he's a mythical figure. Why don't we learn about the rishis? Because of the same mindset that says these are all unreliable, these are all mythical, and so on. So we have the paradoxical situation that the works exist by these mythical figures, all their works exist, material evidence exists, but we pretend it is immaterial to our research. Bizarre, utterly bizarre. That's all I can say. I hope that addresses your question.
Okay, Saurabh Sharma, please.
Namaste, Raj Vedam ji.
Namaste.
My question is very simple and short. So I noticed you mentioned Shrikant Telegiriji as well. So my question is, his work, he says that just analyzing the Rig Veda and the different mandalas in Rig Veda, he's able to easily disprove this whole Aryan invasion bogus thing. So are you, is your views and your study in sync or in harmony with, in agreement with Shrikant Telegiri's views, or is there
Yes.
any disconnect, or is there any
let me expand on that. So
Sure, thanks.
one should not look for 100% consistency between all the Indic scholars. Indic scholars have their opinions, their ideas, and their limitations and their strengths. They got strong strengths in areas and limitations in some other areas. So Shrikant Telegiri ji has done excellent work in analyzing the king lists in the Mitanni kings and the Hittite kings, comparing the chronology of the names. Even the names have got chronology, looking at them, looking at several other evidence. He also used earlier evidence identified by British Indologists. For example, Partiga. He had already identified that the river names that are mentioned in the Rig Veda and others are talking about an east to west. They're talking about east to west. It's not talking about west to east as you'd imagine. It's talking from east to west, implying a migration is coming from the east side of India into the west side of India. Partiga also noticed that the northwest is not holy to India. It is the eastern side, Kashi and other places that were holy. It is not the northwest. Northwest, if they're entered from there, assume those are the early homes. Early homes should be sacred. They were not. They were not sacred. So like this, Partigar has noted several issues, several points that go against the Aryan invasion theory. And as early as 1910, 1920, when he lived, these debates are already taking place. Shrikant Telegiri has expanded on this greatly in his works. And he has shown how the chronology of the names, about the river names, about the words used, archaic words in Sanskrit and the more modern words and other things, as well as analyzing the rules of grammar proposed by these others. He's trying to show that if the homeland, PIE homeland, were in Northwest India, that would perfectly explain everything. So Shrikant Telegiri is not challenging the chronology. What is the chronology? Chronology is saying that 3,500 years ago, there was a PIE language. From this ancestral language came Proto-Iranian. From Proto-Iranian came Sanskrit. From Sanskrit came the Northern Indian Prakrit and other languages. Everything came from that. This is his chronology. All he's saying is, take Sanskrit as a root. It starts from Northwest India. There could have been a PIE language, but it was in Punjab. And once you take that, everything is fine. So the growth of languages from interior India, out of India, and to the rest of the world, everything is fine. So that is his chronology. So Shrikant Telegiri would not agree with some of the astronomical evidence because the antiquity over there is much greater than what he's talking, but in a way it does not matter to him. It is not concerned. His thesis stands alone without the need to look at astronomy. Without the need to look at astronomy, his thesis is powerful. It is talking about an out of India migration. So that one point has fallen out of his work, and that is good enough. So I am a great synthesizer. Look at me as a synthesizer of works. I'm looking at various people's works and seeing how can we coherently and scientifically and logically and rationally, how can we come with a theory, a model? This is what I presented. When I said that I'm presenting my model, the idea was that here is a coherent model that takes all of these works and tries to say, this is how all these things fit together. That's the grand narrative. I hope that answers your question.
Srini Rao, please.
Yes, thanks, Raj Vedam ji. I've been listening to all your lectures. I mean, same content, but very good explanation. My question is very simple. From the genetic model, most of the haplogroups trace to East Africa, 270k years back. And I feel, I mean, looking at what you talked about, there should be some convergence of the haplogroups within India and not necessarily trace everything back to Africa, because I feel there is some DNA analysis missing beyond 70k years for Indian side, on the Indian subcontinent. And most of the focus has been only on Africa, but there was no focus on the haplogroup marker study for India beyond 70K, before 70K.
So thank you, Sriniji. I think one will have to look at the methodology. One has to look at the methodology when such things are proposed. I have not been shy of attacking methodology, because rather critiquing methodology, because I believe there lies the answer. If we don't look at methodology, then all this is received wisdom. We just take whatever they're saying, that there was an Adam genetics, there's an Eve genetics, even though they're literal and figurative, they still use these kind of concepts. So if somebody says the earliest haplogroups have been traced to East Africa, some of the logical questions that must come is, what is the genetic material they have recovered? Genetic material does not survive for long. So what is the material they have found? If we find material remains, which means skeletal remains, we know that even the Harappa sample was so contaminated, it took 4 or 5 attempts and high level of purification before they could get some notion of a genome. Even today, when you talk about genome-wide statistics or others, you need to work very, very hard at missing links. You get one piece here, one piece here, one piece here, and you try to fill in the links with some averaged DNA and things of that nature. So in the case of the markers themselves, when somebody says that traced it back, you must try and ask, what is the model that I've used? Invariably, these are conjectured models that mankind originated in Africa, East Africa, because over there have been found fossils. We have found fossils of the Lucy specimen. We have found fossils of other specimen, whether it is in Olduvai Valley or other places. We have found ancient samples there. So it is a logical inference that maybe early man was over here. But at the same time, I've also shown that there were specimens in India. People might say the homonym specimens found in East Africa are going back 3 million years, 4 million years, 5 million years, and so on. In India, the earliest specimens are about 1 million years old through the stone tools, and maybe even earlier, but we don't know about that. We have not found the specimens. We found the Homo erectus in Narmada Valley 350,000 years ago. So again, methodology is important. When somebody says that all of these markers are showing origin in East Africa, the models are based on some conjecture. And with that model, with some samples that have been obtained much later in the chronological time frame, the present day samples, they try to work backwards and try to have an admixture kind of model that will converge backwards in time to some entity where they can say, yes, this is this old. Secondly, there are assumptions. There are assumptions on rate of change of the mutation. A mutation rate is assumed every 100 years, 1%, 2%. So some kind of an assumption is made. So with these assumptions and with the proposed model and with the samples you have at hand, you try to have your computer mathematical programs converge. And this is what I'm calling out as methodological issues. If you had a different set of assumptions, something different might happen. So people are now asking the question, did modern man originate in Africa, or could it have been China, or could it have been a Denisovan area, that Ukraine area, or could it have been in India? So there are alternate models also possible. So if you find an artifact, old enough artifact, one could definitely set up a mathematical model and try to see if you can get convergence with assumed rates and so on and so forth. So I think the bottom line answer to your question, how come all of these things go only to Africa, is that the earliest? It is possible. At the same time, I'm saying there is a need to critique the methodology. What is the methodology? What is the assumption? What is the way these things were converged? What is the interpretation from the convergence? One has got to examine every one of these things, and hopefully that will give insight into that. In the absence of that, we have papers reported on narrow studies in scientific literature. And the best that we can do is take those and build conjectures around them and bigger models around them. So that is what is happening today. I hope that answers the question, Sriniji.
Anurag Vani, please.
Yeah, sure. Namaste, Rajji. It was really very informative and mind-blowing. I belong to Maheshwar, that is the central point of Indian Valley. So it's really happy to know about the Narmada Valley and all. My question is regarding the Mahabharata era. So yesterday I saw episode of Serial Krishna, and there was an episode like Kalyavan was there, and they are relating this Kalyavan with Muslims. So my question is, when the Mahabharata era was around 7,000 year ago, and Muslim came in existence around 1400 years ago, how come this Kalyavan can belong to Muslims in that area, in that era indeed, in the Mahabharata? So is it something to do with what we should say, the infection of our scriptures by Max Muller or something, or what exactly it is? This
I have not
illogical
seen.
activity.
Yes, I got your question. Thank you, Anuragji. So I have not seen this episode, so I'm not very sure what it refers to. However, I'll address the periphery of your question, that they're claiming that this entity was Muslim, and this Muslim identity only came in 7th century. But as you can guess, the Muslim was not made by Allah put over there at that time. The existing people over there converted to this idea of Islam. So the genetics would not have changed. So even if you go to places like Sindh and other places where people converted wholesale, they were related to the earlier Vedic people who got converted. There could be some influx of West Asia genes also over here, but the conversion would have been so. So when people are trying to identify certain things, I don't know what methodology they're using to identify, but if they had identified in a certain geographical region where today it's Islamic, maybe it makes sense. But again, like I said, I don't know how they'd have done that. You also brought about the timing of the Mahabharata. And as you're aware that today that's a very contentious topic among Indic researchers. So there are a lot of dates that are put on the table, and there is a lot of lively debate going on. And we need to follow these researchers a little more and try to see where are the results taking us, as well as people need to do diligence before we can make calls and say one date versus the other. There's a lot of acrimony going around now. Hopefully at some point we will understand better the methodology of these researchers, the weaknesses of their arguments, as well as the strength of their arguments. So I addressed two topics. I hope it makes sense to you what I just said, Anuragji.
Prasad Gokhale-ji, please.
Namaste, Raji.
Namaste.
Question is about Agastya. Agastya, 1, 2, 3, 4, apparently is migrated south and then colonized the Dravidian land. Just wondering, it didn't show up in your talk today. It's a very well-known theory.
Correct. So today's talk, as you can see, it was very, very rushed. It's very rushed because the time limit is there and the topic is very, very big. So yes, in my earlier talks, I have talked about Agastya. And so Agastya, as he's known in southern India, is a very prominent figure. He's the one who brought Tamil grammar. He's the one who brought Tamil grammar, the Siddhar tradition and other such things is from Agastya. And the tradition, Tamil Sangam tradition says he was there, the first Sangam as well as the second Sangam period, which ranges approximately 7,000, 8,000 years. Now I'm using the internal evidence and claims of the Tamil literature that says there are 3 Sangam periods. The first 2 Sangam periods that happened in the lost area, where the area has been lost, something is sunken. And the last Sangam was in present-day Madurai. That's where it happened. So if over a period of 7,000 years, Agastya was there, it tells us that Agastya was more of a title. That there were people in a particular family who might have had the title of Agastya, and that would have been carried forward for some time. So we don't know how far back that title would have been carried. So I have talked about Agastya in connection with the star Canopus, and relating that with 2 things. One is the precession of equinox, and the second is the late glacial maximum. The late glacial maximum, at the time when most of the water was locked up in ice, I told about how in southern India, the sea level had dropped by 122 meters. That's a very big thing. You could have walked from India to Sri Lanka in that time frame. So given that kind of phenomena, the question is, if there was land far beyond where we can see today, then the chances are there have been a time frame when people could have seen the star Canopus just appearing over the eastern horizon. The southern horizon. It's a southern star. just over the southern horizon. It appeared over there because of precision. And the question is, when did that happen? When did that precision happen? So one can study that using planetarium software and trying to see when did the star appear. Is it appeared at a certain period of time in southern India, starting from Kanyakumari, going all the way to all parts of India. Then it'll go through a disappearance cycle over the next 10,000 years also. That's also going to happen. So I have said at least in 10,000 BCE, going by the Tamil Sangam literature, going by the phenomena that Agastya was called upon to drink the waters of the ocean because the gods wanted to destroy some demons living under the ocean. So he drinks it all up. And going by the secondary idea that the gods, after killing the demons, asked him to give up the water so the world could have water once again, and Agastya gives up the water. So I said that these are Puranic remembrances of the ice ages, both the minimum and the maximum. Maximum ice ages when it is dry, minimum ice ages when the waters have all melted, ice has melted and water levels are up. So both are remembered in the context of Agastya, in the context of the first Sangam period, the second Sangam period, in the context of appearance of Canopus in the south, and so on. So I'm aware that there are other researchers who are attempting to give an even earlier interpretation to Agastya. It is very possible because I've said that in my talks, I've said that the same actor can be used in multiple stories, in multiple scenarios, because that was the literary device used by Puranic writers. For example, in some places, it says that if you look at Ganesha, in some places it says that when he was writing the Vedas for Vyasa, is writing so quickly, he had to break off his tusk, he became Ekadantaya, that's how he wrote, he became a single tusk. In another Puranic story, it says he ate so many sweets, he was wobbling on the road, he fell down and the moon laughed at him, so he broke off his tusk and threw it at the moon. And so it's the second story. So what we see is the Puranic writers used all the divinities and ideas as a palette, like an artist uses different palettes. They use them as a palette, as characters and stories, where they could write the same characters were used, perhaps in the same context, but in different narratives of stories. Similarly, the Agastya story can also be expressed in multiple readings of astronomy, in multiple readings of geological formations, and so on. It does not, one does not invalidate the other. I hope that addresses your question.
Srini Mishra ji, please.
Yeah. Dhanyavad Raji, that was very nice, very nice introduction to all the details. I mean, I've been very interested in this topic, and like knowing like more details really helped. My question would be like very high level. I was again searching, like there was one of your, I think, news article talking about we have to rewrite the history of India with real history. And I believe this is an effort in that direction. My question is like, what does it take to be to that place? Is there any general consensus between like historians and looking at our own historical proofs, how far we are? Is there any government level initiative which all these historians and, you know, archaeologists and everybody's coming together? And
so you said it correctly that this is a political issue. This is a political issue. If Modi can have ordered things like strike in Balakot overnight with a signature, he demonetized 1,000 rupee notes and other such things, surgical strike on the country. Why not a surgical strike on the education system? It is within his capability. There are enough scholars in India who understand these issues, who have got the material to fill in these issues, but they're all sidelined. We don't have the Indic studies institutes where this knowledge can be compiled and made ready to change the education system. However, the scholarship exists. Scholarship exists in various places, various colleges, various scholars who might not be in the mainstream. It requires political will. It requires a desire to change the narrative. It requires these people to recognize that as long as today's toxic narrative is there in the education system, we have generations of deracinated Indian children coming out of these educational systems, and they're turning against the country. The minute they're studying also, they got all the common leftist Marxist memes ready. Their mindset is already against the Indian civilization, against Indian history. The illiteracy is mind-boggling, the amount of ignorance they have about their own systems and how much they have mapped alien ideologies to themselves. So Modi and the others need to recognize this, that the more they ignore it, the more they are strengthening anti-Indian forces politically to become stronger and stronger. Their base is weakening every day that they don't change the education system. Education system is not changed because it's a political necessity. This is the truth. This is what scientists, researchers, and others have been searching for the longest time. We are trying to reconcile what are the ideas that we have of our history as experienced by our ancestors, laid out in their works, how we understand it, how we understand modern sciences of genetics, archaeology, climatology, and all of these things. They're all leading consistently, logically, rationally into a narrative that says this is an ancient civilization. And we need to get that message out, like you correctly said. And we have been trying desperately for so many years. I've been trying to work with states like Telangana, for example. I've helped them to revise the textbooks, but then the revision does not go beyond some simple things. They will not tackle this huge Aryan invasion because on the NCERT board, textbook committee board, there are Marxists and there are other powerful professors who will not allow change to happen. So the received wisdom in academia all over the place continues to propagate the rubbish that you're seeing. So I don't have an easy answer for you. I have been trying very hard for many years now to try and get people interested and change things. But I don't know, short of a revolution, everybody in the country coming out and saying, stop this rubbish, I don't know how it will change.
Yeah, thanks. I just wanted to know. So basically, we're living in the age where it's not education, it's indoctrination. And
yes.
We don't come out, and that was actually the concern which I see. And the more I read, I get filled with the anger, what I see, what we have studied, and what the next generation is being taught. So, but thanks for all the effort, and I hope with everyone's little bit effort, we might be able to move this in upcoming years. But yeah, good to know your thoughts and where we stand today.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, Kaushika ji.
Namaste, Rajji. It was a presentation, and I had one question or maybe an observation, and I want to hear your thoughts about that. I understand, right from the beginning, from the very beginning, I think we have influence of Sanskrit all over India. But isn't it still possible that a South Indian languages have a root which is different from that of Sanskrita? So, if you see the commonality between these languages and the distinctions, irrespective of whatever Caldwell did, it is very likely that these have a different root, but that may be much older, much more prehistorical. And the day we know about Tamil and Kannada, at that very time, they were already influenced by Sanskrita. That's my thinking, and I am very interested to hear your thinking about.
Very good question, Kaushika ji. Thank you for that question. Very interesting. Now, my thesis has been that man lived in India for a very long time. I've shown artifacts from 1 million years ago, all the way to 1000 BC and so on, showed archaeological artifacts. Given that man lived for at least 1 million years in India, the question must come, what language would they have used to communicate? When would language have come into the picture? And when would they have communicated? Now, let me tell you something different, and I'll come back to this answer. So in 1990s, if I'm not mistaken, or maybe 1990s, they found a strange case of a woman who had a speaking disorder somewhere in USA, and they found the same family, the brothers, sisters, and others had a genetic disorder that gave them a speaking problem. And scientists isolated that to a gene called FOXP2, F-O-X-P2, if I'm not mistaken. And they said that the absence of that gives this genetic disorder that they cannot speak, and if they had it, they might have been able to speak that disorder. They also found that mutation appeared about, I'm guessing here, maybe about 50,000 years, 50,000 or 60,000 years ago, that mutation came into the human evolution chain. And so the speculation was that human speech only started about 50,000 years ago. I don't have a way to validate that, and I doubt if anybody else has. This is based upon the understanding of the role of this gene called FOXP2 and its known behavior in this family, and the estimate of its mutation rate and other things going back to 50,000 years ago. This is the conclusion. So that means for millions of years, would humans have communicated the way chimpanzees and others do through grunt and gestures and other such things? Maybe. And maybe this vocalization capability where we can sing and we can talk and we can modulate our voice, all these things happen because we have this FOXP2 since 50,000 years ago. Then the question comes, what language? Language we know is evolving. I, as a mathematician, think of it like a differential equation. A differential equation and a system that is not at rest, not at equilibrium. If you tap it or put some disturbance into it, that is going to oscillate and go in some manner in time. It is evolving in time, and something is going to happen to it. Language is like that. Language is something that is changing all the time. New words are coming in, contact with other languages, new sounds are coming in, and new words are invented for new scenarios, new idioms, and so on. So it's evolving. Unless you had a strong grammar police and others who say, will not let you change, the constraints are put so tightly with a grammar, with a structure, with a pronunciation, and make sure that nobody deviates that, then the rate of change mathematically can be reduced. Like, for example, Paninian grammar, where you might not allow things to change much. So given all these, what I just said, my thinking is that in India, we should never think of India as a homogeneous country. India is a huge country, going from Kanyakumari to the Himalayas to Gandhara to going to Mizoram and beyond. Huge country. So given the size of the country, there's every chance that local regional variations of sounds, local regional variations of culture, religious practice, everything could have evolved. And as they evolve through trade and other cooperation within India itself, a common culture has taken root over thousands and thousands of years. If you put the constraints of Aryan invasion in your mind, those are mathematical constraints. 1500 BC, nothing before 1500 BC. It's Harappa. We don't know anything about that. If you put those chains, you cannot imagine such an antiquity. If you remove those restrictive chains, break those shackles of 1500 BCE, suddenly we can now dare to imagine what would have been there prior to that. How could things have evolved? Suddenly these things make sense that yes, Tamil could have coexisted along with language that is evolving in northern India, maybe something like what Proto-Indo-European was according to Srikant Alagiri and others. And these words, these languages borrowed from each other. They say that Sanskrit borrowed about 30 to 40 words from Dravidian. Dravidian borrowed some words from Sanskrit, and so on and so forth. In different periods of time, we are talking about the last 2,000, 3,000 years. But 10,000 years ago, 20,000 years ago, what was the language? We don't know. We don't know. We just don't have the courage to dream that big. Our linguistics models cannot be pushed beyond 3,000 years. That is what we have. So it's one big unknown over there. So to answer your question again, I think there was a co-evolution. That is what I'm coming to with my model, that India is an ancient country, lot of different people, lot of different regional variations and genetic variations and language variations. They co-evolved, co-evolution through and contact through trade, contact through cultural practices, and that accounts for similarity. So the idiom is there. The common practices are there for the last 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 years. We can observe that north and south. Prior to that, we don't know. There are some intriguing papers over there that one has to see a little carefully and see what do they mean. I give you that idea that Manu, the current Manu of this particular yuga that we are in, came from southern India. Bhagavata Purana says he was a Dravida king. Dravida does not mean race, it means region. He came from the southern region. He came from the southern region and he belonged to the Solar dynasty. And to the same Solar dynasty belonged Rama. And Rama iconographically shown as a dark person. So you see, there are many interesting, intriguing things in the Puranic literature, looking at genetics, looking at language, and so on. So we cannot rule out what would have happened in the past. It's a rich, fertile ground for trying to estimate and understand if we remove these chains of 1500 BCE. I hope that answers your question.
Ashutosh Tiwari ji, please.
Yeah, thank you, Raji. It's an excellent session. I'm really amazed. You already answered one of my questions, which was regarding the similarity or dissimilarity between the Indo-European languages and Dravidian languages. The other thing which I wanted to ask was you briefly touched the point regarding the Saraswati River. So I wanted to ask if sort of drying up of Saraswati River, do you is your theory kind of believe in that, and what is the impact of this on this particular topic?
So the impact is very, very great. Impact is very great because the Rig Veda, I gave the passage where it happens. I can't remember it by heart, but the Rig Veda is talking about the mighty Saraswati River flowing from the Himalayas to the ocean. If the Aryan invasion theory is true, and Aryans came to India in 1500 BCE and wrote the Vedas in the Chandas period between 1200 BC and so on, there was no Saraswati. Saraswati had dried up, according to geological studies, by 1900 BCE. A series of earthquakes, this 200-year monsoon failure, and the changing of the course of Saraswati led to this traditional course drying up. So given that, there is a question of Rigvedic Aryans writing about a mighty river flowing from Himalayas to this one, which means either this is wrong. The leftists have taken the view that Saraswati is a mythical river. They've also tried to say that, oh, on their way to India, they came through Gandhara. It's talking about a river over there, Harakswati or whatever. It's talking about that, not this. This is not the Saraswati. And both are utterly bogus because of the fact that Anirban Chatterjee, I think there is a name I mentioned, IIT Kharagpur, maybe, a researcher from there, who has studied the soil using optical simulated luminescence, a methodology where by heating it up and looking at the electron emission rate, they can calibrate it and try to say how old that particular soil was, when it was last exposed to water, sunlight, and all these things. And his research is showing that, I read out some of those things in that box, that about 30 meters below, 10 to 30 meters below, there was a paleo channel, and there was about 300 kilometer long river course from the Himalaya region to Pakistan border, and which clearly means that there was an ancient river over here. So Saraswati is talking about, Rigveda is talking about that. However, by 1900 BC, it has dried up. Why is this a seminal event? I talked about the Zebu cattle that is there in Mitanni lands, northern Iraq. How did it even go there? And why did people feel the need to go from India over there? Right? So a 200-year monsoon failure can do that. When your rivers dry up, when your river systems dry up, Saraswati has dried up, and other things, you don't have water. You go to the Fertile Crescent or anywhere where there is water. So they went to the Tigris and Euphrates and Nile River valleys where there is water over there. That is why suddenly you find Indian zebu, which is adapted to drought conditions in India, highly prized in that part of the world when they appeared there. So much so that even today in Akkadian seals, we see the long-horned Indian bull that is there in French museums, even today. It is commemorating the arrival of these cattle over there. So it is very important as a trigger for migrations out of India, as a trigger for people like the Mitannis appearing in this culture in this time frame, the Sanskritic speaking people, as a trigger for exchange of stories. If one wonders why are the Greek stories so similar to Indian Puranic stories, it is because the contact was made via the Mycenaeans. Greeks made contact through the Hittites and Mitannis. So their stories are common in both regions of the world. I hope that answers your question.
Sorry, Samir Pandey out for a bit. He lost his connection. So Sanjay Kumar, next, please.
Hi. Raj Vedam. This was a very good talk today. I've been watching your videos on YouTube for the last 3 years. You're very scientific. Your approach is very scientific, and I like that you're not falling into the chronology debate because it gets political and all that.
Yes.
My main question was. We are trying to see the continuity from Indus Valley to Vedic civilization. There have been some recent findings or reported by Professor B.B. Lal, and that has been ignored. He has shown that there was a Shivlinga that was excavated. So have you included that part of the research in your talk?
Yes, yes. I think Sanjeev ji, I think you might have missed that part of my presentation, but in one of my slides, I did show how B.B. Lal had talked. He wrote a paper towards the end of his career called Continuity of Civilization. He challenges the idea that there was a Harappa civilization and a separate Vedic civilization. He says the material evidence is showing a continuity through the so-called Harappa, through the so-called Vedic period. There's a continuity of cultural contact. Some of the things that he found, like I pointed out, one of them was the Pashupati seal. The Pashupati seal showing a Shiva yogi kind of position in a yogic pose. That was one. Second was a swastika symbol. Third one was a sindoor. Sindoor is married women. Even today in India, they wear the kumkum, the parting of the hair. And that was there in terracotta figurines in Harappa. They also found Harappa terracotta figurine showing Namaste. Like I said, Namaste is a deeply Vedantic concept. It says the Narayana in me is bowing to the Narayana in you. It's an admission of the Vedantic idea that Brahman resides in everybody. So that is there in Harappa. What is that doing there if it was not a continuity of thought? Then there is the yoga asana positions. Several figurines are shown in yoga asana positions. Then S.R. Rao found then Kalibangan. He found the Shivalinga. That too has been discussed. So in the context of all of these things, we can conclude that there is no periodization of Harappa and Vedic civilization. Rather, there's a continuity from one to the other. So yes, I talked about that. I talked about that at length in my other talks also.
Okay, Namaste Rajji. Thanks very much for the presentation. I think we are out of time now. The session will end soon. So it was a great talk, Dr. Vedam, and I hope you will give us another presentation in the future soon.